The law was written in stone, carved into the foundation of the great hall where justice was administered, and it had stood unchanged for 600 years. Upon reaching her 21st year, she shall be brought to the seat of judgment, and the law shall claim what it is owed. The woman who would challenge this ancient decree was named Senna, and she had been born under the blood moon 20 years and 11 months ago. She had known her entire life that she was condemned. Her mother had wept when she was born, seeing the crimson moon hanging over the village, knowing what it meant. Her father had tried to hide the date of her birth, had falsified records, had attempted to protect his daughter from the law that demanded her death. But the law was meticulous, and truth always emerged. When Senna turned 15, royal inspectors discovered the deception. The law gave no exceptions, showed no mercy, demanded absolute compliance. On the first day of the month following her 21st birthday, she had tried to flee once 3 years ago, had run to the mountains, believing she could hide in remote places where the law's reach might not extend. But there was no place beyond the law's reach. Tried to find meaning in days that were numbered. But acceptance did not mean she understood. The law claimed she was a breach, a corruption, a threat. But she felt none of those things. She was ordinary skilled at her craft, kind to her neighbors, devoted to her aging mother, who had never recovered from knowing her daughter was condemned. She posed no threat to anyone, harbored no corruption, represented no breach in any natural order she could identify. Why? She had asked the priest who came to prepare her for judgment, who visited monthly to ensure she was spiritually ready to accept her fate. What makes me dangerous? What corruption do I carry? You were born under the blood moon. The ancient wisdom declared that such births are breaches. That is enough. But what if the ancient wisdom was wrong? What if I am not what the law claims I am? It has maintained the kingdom's stability through wars and plagues and dynastic changes. To question it is to question the foundation of our society. You must accept your fate, child. There is no other path. Senna had no choice but to accept. But acceptance did not quiet the questions, did not make the injustice feel less unjust, did not make her approaching death seem reasonable or right. The summons came on the first day of her final month. Royal messengers arrived at her village, presented her with the formal notification, and informed her that she had 1 week to settle her affairs before she would be escorted to the capital. The journey would take 2 weeks, and judgment would be rendered immediately upon arrival. Her mother wept. She visited the places she loved, spoke with everyone who mattered to her, tried to create memories that others would carry after she was gone, and did not look back at the village that had been her entire world. The journey to the capital was strange. The soldiers were not cruel. They treated her with distant respect, as though she were already dead, and they were simply moving a body to its proper burial. Other travelers they passed on the road would whisper when they learned who she was, would make wording gestures, would hurry past, as though proximity to a condemned woman might bring misfortune. But one person responded differently. On the 8th day of travel, as they passed through a market town, a woman approached Senna directly, ignoring the soldiers' attempts to keep people away, and she was innocent of any crime except being born on the wrong night. I am sorry for your loss. I want you to have it, so you know you are not alone in this, so you know that others have walked this path, have questioned this law, have died believing it was wrong. The soldiers pulled Senna away before she could respond, but she clutched the carving tightly, feeling its weight, understanding what it represented. She was not the first. She would not be the last. When they reached the capital 2 weeks after leaving her village, Senna was struck by the city's grandeur. She had never seen buildings so tall, streets so crowded, evidence of such wealth and power. This was where the law was maintained, where judgment was rendered, where 600 years of precedent was preserved and enforced. She was taken directly to the Hall of Judgment, a vast stone structure at the city's center. No woman born under the blood moon shall live beyond her 21st year. The seat of judgment was a throne of dark wood, ancient and imposing, where the king himself would preside over her case. Because this was not a criminal trial, Senna had committed no crime. There was no point in cruelty. She was not being punished, but processed. Senna walked through their stairs, feeling their judgment, their certainty that she deserved what was coming. The king sat upon the seat of judgment, crowned and robed, looking every bit the embodiment of royal authority. He was younger than Senna had expected, perhaps 40. She stands before the seat as a breach in the natural order, as prescribed by 600 years of legal precedent. The law demands her life. Does she contest these facts? Senna's assigned advocate, a man who had spent 30 minutes with her, explaining that his role was purely procedural, stood. She has reached 21 years. The conditions of the old law are satisfied. Then judgment is clear, the high priest said. The law shall be executed, and the breach shall be sealed. Your Majesty, do you confirm this judgment? Senna of Westmark, before judgment is rendered, I would know your thoughts. Do you understand why you must die? Senna felt every eye in the hall turn toward her. This was not standard procedure. Condemned did not typically speak. But the king had asked, and she would answer. No, Your Majesty, she said clearly. I do not understand why I must die. I have committed no crime. I have harmed no one. I pose no threat to the kingdom. I am guilty only of being born on a particular night, of circumstances I did not control and could not prevent. If that is sufficient reason for execution, then I do not understand justice at all. The hall erupted in murmurs. The high priest looked scandalized. But the king raised his hand for silence. The law says you are a breach, he said, that your existence corrupts the natural order. Do you deny this? I do not know what it means, Your Majesty. How can I corrupt an order I do not understand? How can I be a breach when I am simply a person trying to live? The law names me these things, but I have never felt them, never seen evidence of them, never understood what makes me different from any other woman, except the moon under which I was born. The old law was written by those wiser than us, the high priest interjected. They understood forces we no longer see, dangers we can no longer recognize. They created this law to protect us. Senna asked, her voice shaking but clear. What if they were afraid of something that was not actually dangerous? What if 600 years of executions have been based on a mistake, on superstition rather than truth? Blasphemy, someone in the crowd shouted. She questions the foundation of our law. The king raised his hand again, and the hall fell silent. He studied Senna for what felt like an eternity, and she could not read his expression. Finally he said, The law is clear. The precedent is established, insufficient, as justification for execution. Your Majesty, the high priest said urgently, the old law is not subject to your judgment. It predates the current dynasty by centuries. It is foundational. If you dismiss it, you undermine every other law, suggest that any precedent can be overturned on whim. I see no corruption in her. I see no breach. I see a skilled weaver who has lived a blameless life, and who will die, because we have never questioned whether the law we inherited makes sense. This woman will remain in custody, but she will not be executed until I am satisfied that doing so serves justice rather than just preserving tradition. The hall erupted in chaos. Nobles objected, priests protested. Anyone who objects may petition the High Court, but until I rule otherwise, she lives. This proceeding is concluded. He stood and left the hall, and Senna was escorted back to her cell, shocked, confused, not daring to hope, but unable to suppress the flicker of possibility that perhaps, impossibly, she might not die. He assembled a team of 20 scholars, historians, legal experts, archivists, theologians, and gave them unlimited access to every document in the royal library, every ancient text in monastery archives, every historical record that might shed light on the blood moon law's origins. And what they discovered was disturbing in ways that went far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The law had been created during a period of dynastic instability 600 years earlier. At that time there had been a prophecy recorded in a single document that the scholars found buried in the oldest archives. The prophecy had been delivered by a woman known only as the Red Seer, who claimed to have visions of the future. She had told King Aldrin III that his dynasty would fall within 3 generations, brought down by a woman born when the moon weeps blood. Was paranoid. The Civil War had made him see threats everywhere, and he took the prophecy as literal truth, rather than as the ambiguous warning it actually was. He created the blood moon law, mandating that any woman born under a blood moon be executed before her 21st year, the age the Red Seer had claimed the prophesied woman would reach before beginning her rise to power. 17 women had been killed in the first decade after the law's creation. Some had been children, barely past infancy when the blood moon occurred, killed because one paranoid king had believed a vague prophecy from a seer whose other predictions, the scholars discovered, had never come true, and the house of Aldrin had fallen anyway. 3 generations after King Aldrin III, exactly as the Red Seer had predicted, the dynasty collapsed during another civil war. The prophecy had been self-fulfilling in the worst way. The dynasty had destroyed itself through paranoia and injustice, not through any external threat. Yet the law had persisted. The new dynasty that replaced the House of Aldrin had kept the blood moon law in place, had never questioned whether the law served any purpose beyond perpetuating ancient paranoia. And every dynasty since had done the same, preserving the law because it was old, because questioning it would require admitting that centuries of executions had been unjust. The scholars compiled their findings into a comprehensive report, and when the king read it, he was silent for a long time. Then he said to his closest adviser, "Your Majesty," Marin said carefully, "the scholars' report is damning, but you must understand the political implications of overturning this law. Many nobles, many priests, many common citizens believe the blood moon law is sacred, that it protects the kingdom from forces they do not fully understand. If you revoke it, you will face opposition from those who believe tradition should not be questioned. I will not continue murdering innocents to avoid political conflict. But your Majesty, consider the precedent this sets. If you can overturn a law that has stood for 6 centuries, what prevents future kings from overturning any law they find inconvenient? What stability remains if every generation can simply dismiss what previous generations established? The king looked at Maron with something approaching anger. Are you suggesting I should execute Senna of Westmark to preserve the abstract principle of legal stability? That her life is worth less than the comfort of people who want to believe our legal system has never been fundamentally unjust? I have considered them, and I have decided that preventing future injustice is more important than avoiding discomfort about past injustice. The blood moon law will be revoked. Every law that resembles it will be reviewed, and if nobles or priests or common citizens object, they are welcome to argue their case. But they will not convince me that killing innocent women is acceptable simply because we have been doing it for a long time. Maron nodded slowly. Then I will support your decision, Your Majesty. But prepare yourself for significant resistance. You are challenging not just a law but a worldview. The blood moon law created immediate and fierce opposition. The high priest delivered a sermon condemning the king's questioning of ancient law, claiming that some wisdom was beyond human understanding. We do not see the disasters it has prevented because they have been prevented. To dismiss it now is to invite catastrophe. Several noble houses petitioned the king, arguing that overturning well-established law created dangerous precedent, that respect for tradition was foundational to social stability. Your Majesty, one petition read, we understand your compassion for this individual woman, but one life cannot be weighed against the stability of the entire legal system. If the blood moon law is wrong, then so are countless other laws based on ancient wisdom. Where does the questioning end? When does respect for tradition assert itself again? Some supported the king's investigation, seeing the blood moon law as obviously unjust, wondering why it had taken so long for someone in authority to question it, feared that removing ancient protections would bring disaster, worried that questioning tradition would lead to chaos. The debate raged for weeks while the scholars compiled their findings, while the kingdom argued about whether 6 centuries of executions could possibly have been wrong. Senna herself became a strange kind of celebrity. People would gather outside the Hall of Judgment, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, the woman whose case had prompted this unprecedented review of ancient law. Some saw her as a victim deserving justice. A few even claimed she was the prophesied woman from the Red Seer's vision, that her very survival was beginning the process of reshaping the kingdom that the prophecy had warned about. She had gone from being a condemned woman no one noticed to being the center of a kingdom-wide debate about justice, tradition, and the courage to admit past mistakes. During this period she was allowed one visitor, a young scholar named Theron, who had been part of the research team. The prophecy was false, he told her, sitting across a table in her comfortable cell. Or at least it never applied to you or to any woman executed under the blood moon law. The Red Seer who delivered it had no credible history of accurate predictions. So I would have died because of one man's paranoia 600 years ago, Senna said, because he was afraid of shadows and turned that fear into law. Yes, and because every ruler since then lacked the courage to admit the law was wrong. It is easier to execute one woman every few years than to confess that your entire society has been committing murder based on superstition. How many women, since the law was created? Theron pulled out a document. We have found records of 1,743 executions under the blood moon law over 600 years. Some records are incomplete. The actual number may be higher. None of them threatened the kingdom. I have watched him during this investigation, have seen how the findings affected him. He is genuinely horrified by what we discovered. He sees you not as an abstract legal problem, but as a real person who should not die. That personal connection, that inability to abstract you into mere precedent, I believe that will make him follow through, regardless of political cost. For all the women who will be born under blood moons in the future, they should not die because of ancient paranoia. I hope I am right, too. It will establish that precedent can be questioned, that tradition must be evaluated, that longevity does not make injustice just. The opposition intensified. The high priest called for the king's resignation, claiming he had violated his sacred duty to maintain the kingdom's ancient protections. He issued a formal proclamation, read in every city square, delivered to every village, impossible to ignore. After thorough investigation into the foundations of the blood moon law, I have determined that it was created based on false prophecy and political paranoia rather than legitimate legal principle. I therefore declare this law void, null, and without force. No person shall ever again be executed simply for the circumstances of their birth. To those who claim this decision undermines respect for tradition, I say that tradition deserves respect only when it serves justice. We will no longer enforce laws simply because they are old. We will enforce laws because they are right. And when we discover laws that are wrong, we will have the courage to overturn them, regardless of how long they have stood. Senna of Westmark is free. She was never a breach. She was never corruption. She was only a victim of law that should never have existed. Her survival marks the moment when we stopped killing innocents to preserve precedent, when we chose justice over comfort, when we admitted that our ancestors, despite their wisdom in many matters, were catastrophically wrong in this one. But this time the hall was filled with very different energy, not the certainty of condemnation, but uncertainty about what this change meant, what precedent it set, what future it created. The king stood, held up the proclamation, and read it in full. Then he looked directly at Senna and said, I am sorry. They cannot restore the 21 years you lived in fear, cannot undo the trauma of knowing you were condemned, cannot compensate for what this unjust law stole from you. Senna felt tears streaming down her face, not just for herself, but for all the women whose names Theron had listed, all the lives stolen by paranoia masquerading as law. 1,743 women who died under this law. Their families mourn them still. They deserve something more than my survival. I know, the king said, and I have instructed my officials to compile a complete list of every person executed under the blood moon law. We will erect a memorial bearing their names, acknowledging the injustice they suffered. It is insufficient. They deserved life, not memorial, but it is what I can offer now." He gestured to Senna. "You are free to go. Return to your village, to your life, to the future that should never have been in question." She would live. To make certain the law that killed them stayed dead, and that the courage to question tradition that had saved her would persist beyond this moment. The memorial was built 6 months later. It was built in the heart of the capital, impossible to ignore. A massive structure of black stone that curved in a great arc, rising 30 feet high at its center. The names of all 1,743 known victims were carved into the stone. But more than just names, the memorial included testimony. She was innocent. She died because the law said she was corrupt, but she was the gentlest person I ever knew. Her name was Alia. Remember her. "My sister loved animals," another said. She would rescue injured birds, nurse them back to health, release them when they could fly again. She dreamed of becoming a healer. Her name was Mira. She deserved to live. The law did not care. It claimed both their lives. Her name was Senna, like the woman who survived, who finally broke this evil law. My daughter did not live to see justice, but I am grateful that her namesake did. The memorial's dedication ceremony was massive. Thousands attended, families of victims, supporters of the king's decision, even some who had opposed the law's revocation, who came to acknowledge the human cost of what had been done. The king spoke, and his words were raw with emotion. This memorial is testament to our failure. For 600 years we killed innocent women because we were too cowardly to question whether an ancient law was just. We valued stability over lives, precedent over truth, tradition over basic human decency. I cannot resurrect the dead. I cannot undo 6 centuries of injustice, but I can ensure we remember them. Ensure their deaths were not forgotten. Ensure we learn from this horror so it never happens again. Every person who visits this memorial should leave asking themselves, what laws do we enforce today that future generations will condemn as we now condemn the blood moon law? The woman this memorial is named after, Senna of Westmark, survived. Because I asked those questions, because I could not look at her and continue a law that my investigation proved to be based on paranoia and fear. But I should not have been the first to ask. Kings and queens for 600 years should have asked. Every person who knew about this law and never questioned it shares responsibility for these deaths. Let this memorial stand as a reminder that justice requires courage. Courage to question what has always been done. Courage to admit our ancestors were wrong. Courage to choose what is right over what is easy. And courage to look at actual human beings rather than at abstract precedent, to see people rather than policies, to value lives over stability. Senna attended the dedication. She met descendants of women who had died centuries earlier, people who barely knew the names of their executed ancestors but who came anyway to honor their memory. One elderly woman approached her during the ceremony. "My great-great-grandmother was executed under the blood moon law 200 years ago. I never knew her, obviously. But family stories passed down say she was wise, talented, beloved. She was a healer in her village. She saved lives. And then the law took hers. Thank you for surviving, for prompting the king to question what should have been questioned centuries ago. My great-great-grandmother did not deserve to die. None of them did. My survival is luck and one man's courage. But the memorial ensures they are remembered, that their deaths meant something, even if that something is just recognition of injustice. The memorial became a place of pilgrimage. Scholars studied it as example of how societies could normalize evil through bureaucratic process, carrying with her the compensation the king had provided and a profound sense that her life now had purpose beyond just surviving. She resumed her work as weaver, but she also became something else, a living reminder of the blood moon law's injustice, a speaker about the importance of questioning tradition, a symbol of what could happen when one person had the courage to challenge what seemed unchallengeable. She would tell her story, the 21 years she lived knowing she was condemned, the trial where the king postponed judgment, the investigation that revealed the law's rotten foundations, the moment she was declared free. How many others will die if you are not willing to ask them? Her speeches were controversial. Some praised her for using her survival to promote critical examination of law and tradition. Others accused her of promoting dangerous skepticism, of encouraging people to question everything. Not all tradition is bad, she would tell audiences, but all tradition should be justifiable. If a law cannot be defended with more than we have always done it this way, then it deserves to be questioned. One king finally asked that question. Ask whether the laws serve justice, and have the courage to challenge them if the answer is no. It was composed of 12 members, 4 legal scholars. They examined laws about property rights, criminal punishment, social obligations, religious practice, and governance structure. Some laws they upheld as still serving justice. One law they overturned prohibited commoners from learning to read. The commission found no justification for it beyond preserving hierarchy. The law had been created during a period of widespread banditry, but centuries later it was being applied to people who stole food to avoid starvation, maintaining accountability while acknowledging that not all theft deserved death. The commission abolished it, recognizing that it served no purpose beyond perpetuating gender inequality. Each overturned law created controversy. Senna served on the commission for 2 years, invited by the king to provide perspective as someone who had nearly been killed by unjust law. Her presence was symbolic but also practical. She had lived the reality of what it meant to be abstract victim of legal process, and she could remind other commission members that laws affected real people, that policy decisions had human costs that should never be treated as acceptable collateral damage. Every law we examine, she would tell her fellow commission members, should be evaluated by asking, if this law demanded my death, my suffering, my loss, could I be made to understand why that was just? If the answer is no, if the law can only be defended by appeals to tradition or claims that we must trust ancient wisdom, we do not understand. Justice must be explicable, must be defensible on its own merits rather than just on its longevity. The commission's work continued for 15 years, long after Senna's 2-year term ended, and it fundamentally transformed the kingdom's legal system. Not all changes were as dramatic as abolishing the blood moon law, but cumulatively they reshaped how the kingdom understood justice. Senna lived for 47 more years after her scheduled execution date. Years that should never have been in question, but that felt precious precisely because they had nearly been stolen. She married a scholar named Theron, the the same young man who had visited her, in custody to explain the investigation's findings, and they had 3 children together, each of whom grew up knowing their mother's story, knowing how close they had come to never existing because of an unjust law. She continued her work as weaver, creating pieces that were sought throughout the kingdom. Her most famous work was a massive tapestry depicting the memorial wall with every name readable in tiny, perfect stitching. It took her 3 years to complete, and when it was finished, she donated it to the memorial itself. She also wrote. Her memoir, titled 21 Years Under Condemnation, became required reading in many schools, a first-hand account of what it meant to live, knowing you were condemned to die, of what it felt like to be abstract victim of legal precedent, of how one king's willingness to question transformed despair into survival. "I do not want to be remembered as the woman who survived," she wrote in the memoir's final chapter. "I want to be remembered as the woman whose survival prompted questions that should have been asked centuries earlier." 1,743 women died before I was born. That is not heroism on my part. That is luck. The real heroism belongs to the king who questioned, to the scholars who investigated honestly, even when the truth was uncomfortable, to every person who supported the law's revocation, despite being told that questioning tradition was dangerous, that we could choose justice over stability, that we could be better than our ancestors even while respecting them. When Senna died at 68, peacefully, surrounded by family, the kingdom mourned a woman who had become a symbol of justice over tradition, of the importance of questioning what seemed unquestionable, of the value of looking at actual human beings rather than at abstract legal principles. The king, now elderly himself, nearing the end of his own life, attended her funeral. He spoke briefly, and his words captured what her survival had meant. Senna of Westmark was condemned to die by a law that stood for 600 years. She lived because I asked one question: why? That question led to investigation. Investigation led to truth, and truth led to justice. But I was not the hero of this story. Senna was. She stood before me, condemned and powerless, and she asked questions I should have asked without prompting. She challenged the law not through violence or rebellion, but through simple, devastating questioning. What makes me dangerous? How am I corrupt? Why must I die? Those questions posed by a woman who had every reason to be silent, who gained nothing by speaking, who risked angering the court that held her life in its hands, those questions saved her life and changed this kingdom. The memorial bears 1,743 names. Senna lived, but they died. And I carry that guilt as every king before me should have carried it. We should have questioned this law centuries ago. We should have looked at actual women condemned under it and asked why they deserved to die. We should have investigated before we executed, but we did not. We valued stability over lives, tradition over truth, comfort over justice. Senna's survival marks the moment we stopped making that choice. The moment we decided that questioning tradition was not dangerous but necessary. The moment we chose to be uncomfortable with our past rather than comfortable with our present injustice. I am grateful I lived to know her, to be prompted by her to be better than I might otherwise have been. Courage to choose what is right even when what is wrong has the weight of centuries behind it. The memorial remained, still visited, still adding stones as descendants of victims came forward with testimony. The Commission of Legal Review continued its work through multiple generations, meant to ensure that the human cost of bad law was never abstracted away. The tradition of including descendants on the Commission proved to be one of its most valuable features. Understood that precedent was not neutral but carried the weight of accumulated suffering. One Commission member, 3 generations after Senna's death, was a woman named Kira, whose great-grandmother had been executed under the Blood Moon Law. Kira became known for her fierce questioning of any law that imposed significant harm, and she had a particular reputation for challenging justifications that relied on tradition without substance. My great-grandmother died because people believed tradition was more important than truth, she would say during commission debates. I will not perpetuate that mistake. If you want to uphold a law that causes suffering, her presence on the commission and the presence of others like her ensured that the spirit of questioning that had saved Senna's life remained active, rather than becoming itself a tradition that was honored in name but not in practice. And the question Senna had asked, "Why must I die?" became a foundational question in legal philosophy throughout the kingdom. Any law that demanded death, suffering, or significant loss was required to provide justification beyond tradition, beyond precedent, beyond appeals to ancient wisdom. It had to explain, in terms understandable to those it affected, why the cost it imposed was just and necessary. This standard transformed legal culture. Laws could no longer hide behind their own longevity. They had to be defensible on their merits, had to serve purposes that could be articulated clearly, had to create good that outweighed the harm they imposed. The kingdom became known throughout the realm for its willingness to revise laws, for its commitment to justice over stability, for its recognition that wisdom included the ability to admit when past generations had been wrong. Other kingdoms watched this transformation with mixture of fascination and horror fascination, because it seemed to work. Some kingdoms sent scholars to study the memorial, to understand how open acknowledgment of past injustice could strengthen rather than weaken a society. These scholars would return home with reports that confused their rulers. The kingdom is not collapsing from admitting past wrongs. It is thriving, can acknowledge mistakes, can adapt to new understanding. Insisted that stability required maintaining precedent regardless of justice, that admitting past mistakes would undermine all authority. These kingdoms continued enforcing their own versions of the Blood Moon Law laws that seemed unjust, but that were defended as necessary to preserve order, to maintain tradition, to respect ancient wisdom. And women in those kingdoms died year after year, sacrificed to laws that their societies lacked courage to question. Some of their families heard about Senna's story, about the kingdom that had abolished its Blood Moon Law, and they would try to flee, try to reach a place where their daughters might survive. Some succeeded, many did not. Senna's story spread beyond the kingdom through these refugees, through travelers, through scholars who studied the memorial. It became a tale told in many lands, adapted to many cultures, but always carrying the same core message, that tradition should serve justice rather than justice serving tradition, that laws affecting real people deserved real justification. 100 years after the Blood Moon Law's abolition, the kingdom held a centennial commemoration at the memorial. Thousands attended, including descendants of the 1,743 victims, descendants of those who had worked to abolish the law, and people from other kingdoms who had come to witness how a society honored such a history. The current king, 5 generations removed from the one who had spared Senna, spoke about the law's legacy. A century ago, my predecessor was asked a simple question by a condemned woman. Why must I die? That question prompted investigation. Investigation revealed that an ancient law was based on paranoia and fear rather than truth. And one king had the courage to say, "This law is wrong, regardless of how long it has stood, regardless of the precedent it represents, regardless of the comfort people take in believing their ancestors were wise in all things." That courage to question, courage to investigate, courage to admit past error saved Senna of Westmark's life. But it did more than that. It transformed our entire legal culture, established that no law is beyond examination, created expectation that justice must be explicable and defensible rather than just traditional. We continue to benefit from that transformation. Our laws are stronger because they must justify themselves. Our society is more just because we acknowledge that justice requires constant questioning, constant evaluation, constant willingness to admit when we are wrong. We honor the 1,000. The centennial also saw publication of a comprehensive academic work examining every known aspect of the blood. There was Mira, who had been a talented musician, executed 3 days before her 21st birthday, whose unfinished compositions were preserved by her family and eventually published a century later. There was Alia, who had been a village healer, whose medical knowledge was recorded by her apprentice and became foundation for advances in herbal medicine. They had dreams and talents and relationships. The academic work became required reading in legal education. It served as both historical document and cautionary tale, showing exactly how societies could normalize evil through bureaucratic process, how people could participate in injustice while believing they were serving justice, how the appearance of legitimacy could make murder seem acceptable. Alara was an infant, but she grew up immersed in her great-grandmother's story, understanding that her own existence was contingent on one king's willingness to question an ancient law. Not my own courage, I have done nothing heroic, but the courage of my great-grandmother to stand before a king and ask, "Why must I die?" The courage of that king to actually seek an answer rather than accepting that the law's existence was answer enough. The courage of scholars to report honestly what they found, even when the truth was uncomfortable. I am 3 generations removed from the blood moon law's abolition. That law never threatened me personally, but I carry its legacy nonetheless. I carry the knowledge that I live in a society that can admit mistakes, that can change, that can choose justice over comfort, to make certain that future generations inherit a kingdom that examines its laws rather than simply enforcing them. My great-grandmother should not have needed to be brave. She should have been born into a kingdom that had already questioned the blood moon law, that had already recognized its injustice. But she was not. She was born into a kingdom that needed one woman's desperate questions and one king's willingness to listen. That should not have been necessary. But it was. And we honor both of them, not by pretending everything is fixed now, not by believing we have found all injustices and corrected them, but by continuing the work they started, the work of questioning, investigating, and having courage to overturn what is wrong regardless of how long it has stood. But one king had looked at an actual person rather than at abstract precedent, had questioned rather than blindly enforced, had chosen justice over tradition. And in that choice he had saved not just Senna's life but the soul of the kingdom itself, proving that even 600 years of precedent could be overturned when it was revealed to be wrong, proving that justice required looking at real people rather than at abstract principles, and having the strength to admit when what had always been done was fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. This has been a story of unjust laws and courageous questioning, of precedent challenged and lives saved through the willingness to admit past mistakes. If this tale moved you, if you recognize the danger of enforcing tradition without examining justice, when should old laws be questioned? How do we balance respect for precedent with demands for justice? What does it mean to have the courage to admit our ancestors were wrong? Your reflections give these stories meaning, and I would be honored to hear them. If you enjoyed this journey into the world of the silent bond, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel, so you may return when the next story is told, when another law is questioned, and when justice perhaps prevails once more.